Hello everybody, and a belated Happy New Year. If you don't already know me, my name is Sarah Hunnock. I'm the chair of the webinar committee, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the first of our 2024 SRP lunchtime webinars in association with AURPO on today's topic of safety cases. I will just go through the ground rules really quickly. So, as always, we'll record the webinar and upload it to the YouTube channel, and all the questions that are asked in the question box, there should be a little speech bubble. You click on that, you can pop your questions in there. Ask them as we're going through the talk, and like any that you see somebody else has asked that you'd also like the answer to. And at the end, we will go through them, asking the speaker with the most liked coming first. So just to check that you are listening to me, I know that I repeat these same ground rules every time. One thing has changed this time, the email address that you need to send the code to get your CPD points. So it's changed slightly, and we will pop it into the chat so you can see that throughout the talk. And as always, please just send us your feedback. You will get a link at the end of the webinar to pop in your feedback. And we just need to know how you think we're doing, what we can do better, and any ideas for any webinars going forward in the future. So as always, I've got to plug joining the SRP. If you're not already a member, look at all these fabulous benefits that you will get if you join us. You can just pop onto our website and the instructions are on there on how to join. And then just a reminder that coming up in 2026, we've got the 7th European IRPA Congress coming to Liverpool. It's the first time that it's come to Liverpool. It's the first European IRPA Congress to be held in the UK, so it's quite a big thing for us. We're already starting to organise it. Pop onto the website and get yourself registered for it. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Professor Pete Cole, who is an SRP past president and the AURPO past president. Over to you, Pete.
Thanks, Sarah. I hope everybody can hear me. Welcome everyone to another one of these training webinars. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Sam Steed is the Nuclear Waste Services Environmental Safety Case lead for the Low-Level Waste Repository here in the UK. He is currently responsible for managing and developing the environmental safety case for the Low-Level Waste Repository site. He leads a dedicated team of disposal safety experts tasked with ensuring disposals are safe, both for the public and the wider environment. He started his career by literally getting his hands dirty managing waste consignments from Sellafield before moving to work at the Low-Level Waste Repository's Waste Services Division to establish new waste treatment services. He has been working on the environmental safety case for the last 6 years. Sam has a particular interest in the radiological protection principles associated with waste disposal and how they are applied to future generations. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Sam. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm delighted to be able to be here today to talk to you all about my favourite subject in the whole world, environmental safety cases. So without any further ado, let's make a start. So I like to use this headline. This is a real headline from the Guardian newspaper to remind everyone of the importance of safety and particularly environmental safety when we're talking about disposing of radioactive waste. So environmental safety cases, and my job is all about the safety of radioactive waste disposal. Now, as is often the case with the national news media, this headline isn't necessarily untrue, but it doesn't tell the whole story. At the Low-Level Waste Repository, we do have risk of coastal erosion, and we're open and honest about those risks, and we'll talk a bit more about those later. But so the headline is understandable in the context, but it just highlights the real challenge that we have, the challenge of our generation to really do a fantastic job, and the challenge that we have in dealing with this hazard that will last for hundreds, thousands, potentially millions of years. So it's an incredibly difficult job we have to protect that from the environment over those timescales. But with sort of our industry leading approach and team, we think we're doing a pretty good job. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. So what is an environmental safety case? And then I'm going to use the example of our environmental safety case for the low-level waste repository in the UK to sort of illustrate the contents and aspects to consider in an environmental safety case. Then, because we're here as the Society for Radiological Protection, I'm going to talk a bit about the radiological protection principles and how they apply to radioactive waste disposal, particularly how they apply to future generations that could be impacted by waste that we dispose. So just a really quick overview, really quick run through of environmental safety case. Who, what, where and when. It's all about demonstrating that when we dispose of radioactive waste, then that is safe for the environment. So we do lots of calculations and impact assessments. We're considering people as well as biota. The word environment often throws people off, but actually the public is our principal sort of receptor that we consider. And we consider both radiological and non-radiological safety. So as I said, consider the public, not workers. And because we're disposing of radioactive waste, the hazard remains for a long period of time. We have to look many thousands of years into the future to do that, to demonstrate safety. We also have to demonstrate that the facility design and our arrangements are what's called optimized. That means it's as low as it reasonably can be, or a LARA or a LARP in other circles. These words are quite interchangeable. We're regulated by the Environment Agency, not the Office for Nuclear Regulation, and it's required for a permit to dispose of radioactive waste. And we also use the environmental safety case as a tool to manage the site. It's not just a set of calculations that sit on the shelf. It does things like defining waste acceptance criteria. It informs design choices that we make and lots of things like that. So it's a live living entity that we're constantly using to improve our operations, improve our arrangements and things like that. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. So just to go over that again, breaking it down to the 3 words, because I'm a simple guy, I like simple explanations. Environmental. Environmental, we're thinking off-site, basically. Everything off-site includes the public, includes the air we breathe, includes the water sources and things like that. And we have a focus on the long term because that's when things get really tricky in terms of demonstrating that safety. When you can't assume that there'll be a fence around the site and you can't assume that people won't be living on top of the site and things like that, that's when it gets quite difficult. Safety, radiological safety, and also non-radiological safety. When I say non-radiological safety, I'm talking about things like releases of hazardous substances. I'm not talking about sort of conventional safety. It's more like releases to things to groundwater and things like that. And the word case is an interesting one. What do we actually mean? What does that word mean, case? Well, if you think of your courtroom drama, they get to the end of the lawyer's there and they get to the end of their thing and they say, I rest my case. It is a bit like that we put forward arguments and evidence as to the arguments and evidence as to why we think what we're doing is safe for the environment. And that's the case we're putting forward to our regulator and the case that we work within to seek permission to dispose of radioactive waste. So just because I'm going to talk about the low-level waste repository environmental safety case in particular, thought I'd give a quick overview of that. So low-level waste is defined in law within the UK as less, according to these numbers, it is quite a strict definition that dates back quite a long period of time, and that's currently subject to a bit of debate. But there is a lot of it. This is potentially slightly out of date numbers, but not. We're still in this ballpark. We're talking, millions of cubic meters of material that will be generated over the next 100 years or so. Predominantly, that will come from things like decommissioning and demolition of nuclear sites and reprocessing sites. Sellafield being the principal source. But we also get material from things like operational nuclear power stations, spent fuel reprocessing, defence sector, oil and gas extraction, hospitals, pharmaceuticals, university schools. And it's things like personal protective equipment, often demolition material, protective equipment, all sorts of material. And at our site, our site started operation in the 1950s with this tumble-tipped waste disposed into clay-lined trenches. And that practice continued all the way up to the 1990s. And I'll just give you a quick flavour of what we're talking about. And this waste was covered over by an interim cover. Quite a rudimentary, although there is a clay lining, it's quite a rudimentary operation. Originally, it was used for waste from Sellafield at the time, and we have around 800,000 cubic meters of waste in the trenches. But nowadays, and in the 90s, we progressed to a more advanced solution for disposing of low-level waste. We take waste in metal containers, which are grouted with a cementitious grout to fill voids and provide a substrate for absorption and things like that. And those are placed in concrete vaults that have a low permeability liner of bentonite-enriched sand. And that's the practice that continues up into this day. And you can see here, that's the grouted waste form, showing that it provides a much more stable foundation. Here's just an aerial image of the site. You can see if I can get my pointer. These are the trenches that have been covered. To the north of this image, this is what we call Vault 8. This is nearly full, and this is the currently operating vault here, Vault 9. And this is just another image showing that. We have the grout plant is up here. We have space for future vaults to be constructed in this area. And as you can see here as well, we have some close neighbours. So there's houses here and houses there. So we have to consider our neighbours quite carefully, both as just from being a good neighbour, but also from a radiological protection perspective. These are our critical groups, obviously. Some of the dose and sky shine coming from Vault 8 and Vault 9. The external radiation, it's not particularly high in the context, but it is quite a close neighbour. We also have a site of special scientific interest here, which is the Drigg Dunes, which is quite interesting from an ecological perspective. We consider impacts to groundwater. Okay, so that's just a really quick overview of the LRWR site, but now I'm going to talk about what our environmental safety case says, and hopefully that will illustrate what an environmental safety case is. I'm going out on a limb here. I think people love analogies, and I asked a few people, what analogy can I use to explain an ESC? And I'm going to give this a go, but it takes some real thinking about. So I'm going to try and explain an ESC using the analogy of baking a loaf of bread. But you're going to have to bear with me a little bit because it takes some mental gymnastics. So do wish me luck. So here's ESCs and a loaf of bread. So if you're trying to make an environmental safety case, the first thing you need to understand is what you're trying to make a case for. What's your source term? What's your inventory? What's the waste that you've got? What's its characteristics? Quite hard to understand if anything's safe if you don't know what it is in the first place. And that is sort of where we were quite a few years ago, because records of disposals to the trenches had very, very limited information. They sort of just gave total dose rates and total activity. So we had to take a massive program of work to sort of rederive that inventory to a level of detail that was necessary to support actually making a case. And that actually involved bringing back retired operators to interview them about things like the waste characteristics, about what they did, about what scrutiny they applied and things like that. So actually defining the disposed inventory was quite a difficult task. So that's sort of task one. And referring to our loaf of bread, so the inventory, yeah, it's your ingredients. It's your ingredients of a loaf of bread. It's your flour, it's your water, it's your yeast. Okay, so we made a decent start. But we've also got to consider the future inventory. What's going to come in the future? What are we going to dispose in the future? That's really, really uncertain because it relies on waste generators telling us what they're going to produce all the way out to the year 2130. The radiological content, the non-radiological content, the volume, and a lot of this waste hasn't been generated yet. So it might be a building that's there, or it might be a building that hasn't even been built yet, but they still have to be able to tell us what waste is going to come when they take it down. So we've got to be able to react and deal with that uncertainty and fold that into the environmental safety case, which does introduce a lot of, as I said, a lot of uncertainty. So this is also the ingredients of our bread, like bread flour, but it's like you have to go to the shop and buy it, and you don't know what bread flour is going to be in stock until you get to the shop. We've got a good idea what the bread flour, what might be available, but you've got to be flexible enough to be able to adapt to what's in stock. You're not sure what you're going to get. So now we've got a reasonable understanding of the inventory. It doesn't just sit there in the repository sort of doing nothing. The next subject I want to talk about is what we call the near field. And that's about understanding how the chemical conditions of the waste will evolve over time. So we're talking thousands of years and things like, there's lots of chemical reactions going on. I am a physicist, I am not a chemist, so this is not my area, but it is a highly, highly important area for an environmental safety case, because the chemical conditions affect things like contaminant mobility, how water will flow, what gases might get generated, are they radiologically labeled gases? And we have a team of expert chemists working on this that pump out the chemical conditions and the parameters that can be used for our impact assessments. And just for a short aside, ad break, we are hiring for specialists to work in this area. So if you've got an interest in chemistry and you've got an interest in disposal safety, see me after class and we can talk. So going back to our loaf of bread, this is the proving stage. All these chemical reactions going on in our loaf of bread and kind of making it a bit more interesting. There's gases being generated. It's all that fun stuff going on in there. Now, the next thing I'll talk about is the engineering of the facility, and particularly the engineered barriers. So we optimize the engineering design with respect to long-term environmental safety. So this is about making sure the waste is isolated and contained from the environment for as long as possible. At our repository, the most important barrier we have is the final engineered cap. That's the cover that goes over the waste. It minimizes water ingress, keeping the waste dry for as long as possible, minimizing any releases to groundwater. But equally important to making the barriers as effective as possible is understanding how they degrade over time, because particularly for a surface or a near surface facility, we have to accept that the barriers won't last forever and that releases will eventually occur. But understanding the timing and the nature of the degradation is really, really difficult when you're looking over these timescales. So that's a really important area for us, understanding how they degrade and factoring those into our assessments. And it's actually something we're working quite closely on at the moment and developing. So yeah, I'm really struggling here with the bread, but we're setting the oven temperature. We're looking at the timings and we're baking the bread. So things are evolving. Things are kind of evolving over time. The next aspect, big aspect of environmental safety case is site understanding and hydrogeology. So once you accept that releases will eventually occur, because when you're looking over these timescales, you've got to understand where the releases will go. So that requires a detailed understanding of the hydrogeology surrounding the site. So that's things by hydrogeology, I mean water flowing underground, basically. And this diagram is a conceptual understanding of our hydrogeology. So the LLWR site is here, and basically our program of site investigation shows that water will drain vertically down to the regional geology, where it eventually will be released to the intertidal zone, so effectively to the sea or to the beach. Now, from a radiological protection perspective, that's quite favourable because people don't use the beach for agriculture, they don't use it for habitation. So that's good in a way, but we do have to consider the potential for contaminated drinking water to be abstracted from a well down between the repository and the coast at some point in the future. So my analogy is really getting difficult now, but this is like the smells are wafting from the oven as we bake our bread, and they get out, and it's hard to tell where they're going to go. Sometimes they go where you don't want them to go, and they seem to have a way of getting out, and we've got to understand where those smells, where those wafting smells are going to get around the house. Yeah, I told you it was a tough analogy. But now we understand where they go. The final step effectively is understanding how, once you understand where the contamination is going to end up, how will that impact on people in the environment? So we have a number of main release pathways that we consider. The first one, as I've talked about, is releases to groundwater. So as I mentioned, the abstraction of a well, we also consider consumers of marine foodstuffs because of the releases to the sea. We also consider releases of carbon-14 labelled gases directly to the cap. So methane that gets generated in the repository can include carbon-14. Carbon obviously can get everywhere in the food chain. It gets oxidized to CO2 in the soil zone and can enter the food chain by root uptake, foliar uptake, and get into plants and animals and all sorts of ways. We also consider impacts from inadvertent human intrusion over the long term. And we also, at the repository, have to consider the impacts from coastal erosion. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So this final step in our loaf of bread, we've made the bread and now we're tasting it. Is it any good? Can I serve it to my guests? Can I serve it to my regulator? Hopefully it is. And in our case, yeah, we've made a pretty good loaf of bread. We've made a pretty good safety case, so we're quite happy. Just going back to coastal erosion, because this is possibly the most emotive and sort of controversial topic of our safety case. The Low Level Waste Repository site is 350 metres from the coast at its nearest point, around here. And we know from our monitoring programme that this is an eroding coastline, and sea level rise in the future will accelerate this. So we do conclude in the safety case that coastal erosion will disrupt the repository within a few hundred to thousands of years. And we conduct impact assessments on users of the coast, assuming that erosion is occurring, and we demonstrate that's safe. So we've demonstrated that those impacts are consistent with regulatory guidance. It is low level waste, it will decay, but it does restrict the waste we're able to accept in the future. So we only accept waste that's consistent with safe limits. So even though we're then considering results of the assessments, and it's just not just about meeting regulatory criteria, we have to keep demonstrating that we're improving and that results are, and consider improvements we could make across the board to minimize impacts even further. So we might make changes to the design, we might make changes to the waste acceptance criteria, emplacement strategies. We've always got to demonstrate that we're lowering the impacts as far as reasonably practicable. So even if our bread tastes pretty good, we've still got to think, how do I make it better? Do I tweak the ingredients? Do I change the oven temperature? Do I put it in a different bread tin? And this is the real art form of an ESC. It takes a true understanding of how everything fits together to determine the appropriate changes that would make improvements. And we never stop. Some things are out of our control, like the disposed inventory, but others, like the design of future vaults, are within our gift, the design of the container and things like that, and the waste acceptance criteria. So we just hope that our bread is more like this, and it's not so much like this. That's the idea, but generally it's like it is on the left. Maybe we could do a little bit better, although that looks pretty good for me. So we're just going to demonstrate the impact. I just wanted to demonstrate the impacts from the repository using a little game of play your cards right. So this is a simple game of higher or lower. You've got two choices, higher or lower, and I want you to use the reactions buttons within Microsoft Teams if you can. So if you go to your Microsoft Teams window, you should be able to put a little reaction button, and I want you to use the thumbs up button if you think the answer is higher, and I want you to use the shocked face button if you think the answer to the question I'm going to ask is lower. So just it's not a test, it's just a little bit of fun. So starting off with our first number, which is our regulatory, well, our equivalent risk guidance level, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a minute. So we have to try and demonstrate over the long term that the risk from the repository is a 1 in a million risk of a fatal cancer or hereditable defect, and we equate that to around 20 microsieverts, and that's sort of our risk. That's our risk guidance level. So is the normal background dose received by an average person over 1 day, is that higher or lower than 20 microsieverts? And use your reaction button now, thumbs up for higher and shocked face for lower. I was assured that this was work, and I can't see any reactions, unfortunately. So maybe Nigel could or Sarah could chime in and say what the general, if anyone can see. I'm going to look at the chat to see if this is actually working. Otherwise, we're a bit. Yeah, Sarah can't see any. Hopefully, everyone else, you can all see. Viewers, so you can, okay, you can see each other's votes, but we can't see. Fantastic. So, okay, so you can judge for yourself whether. I would have loved to know if you get these right, but the answer is lower, 7.4 microsieverts. This is good because it means I'll get through this slide a bit quicker if I can't see your answers and take the mick out of all your wrong answers. So that's 7.4 microsieverts. So is the peak dose from consuming contaminated marine foodstuffs due to LLWR groundwater releases in the future, do you think that's higher or lower than 7.4 microsieverts? I'll give you 5 seconds to vote. It's a lot lower, 0.006 microsieverts. Well done to those of you who said lower. It's not a high number. So is the dose from living on a small holding on the cap on top of the waste in the year 2230, and the impacts come generally from carbon-14 gas, is that higher or lower than consuming marine foodstuffs? It's 2.4 microsieverts. It's higher. Well done to those of you who said that. How about this is an inadvertent human intrusion event we have to consider. So, well, we don't have to, we consider it drilling 5 boreholes randomly into the waste form in the year 2230. So this is inadvertent human intrusion. Someone might be doing a sort of investigation to see whether they can construct something on this without knowing that there's waste there. Higher or lower than 2.4 microsieverts? Higher, 25 microsieverts. Well done. By the way, if you got all of them right, just send me. If you do get all of these right, send me a message. Unless you actually work in the ESC team, in which case you don't get any marks. Annual dose from inshore fishing off Drigg Beach as the facility erodes. So this is related to coastal erosion. Do you think that's higher or lower than 20 microsieverts? Vote now. It's 11 microsieverts, much lower. These are all events that we consider in the environmental safety case. Annual dose from walking the dog on Drigg Beach. We think someone walking the dog pretty much every single day on Trigg Beach whilst the facility is eroding and just sort of walking around. Is that higher or lower than 11 microsieverts? Higher or lower than fishing and eating the fish? And okay, hopefully you've all had a quick vote. It's higher, 19 microsieverts. Hopefully what you can see from this, as we are all interested in radiological protection, these are incredibly low numbers in the context of radiological protection. These are doses to the representative person. So like these are high-end users, high-end activity, high-end habits that we're assuming. So we've met the environmental agency's requirements. They set out those requirements in a document called the GRA, which we follow. It's safe to use the LRWR to dispose of low-level waste. We have an optimised plan for how to develop the site, and we have the capacity to accept all of the UK's low-level waste that requires disposal. But that's, as I mentioned before, an ESC does not just sit on the shelf. It's also a tool to manage and develop the site, and that's something that I'm particularly interested in. And this is where it becomes much more than just a science project. You have to know we're really embedded within the site operations, and that's a real plus point, I think, of the LRWR and how we use the ESC and how we use concepts of environmental safety to develop what we're doing. So the most obvious one is we set waste acceptance criteria. So whilst in the ESC we've shown that we can accept the vast majority of low-level waste, we have had to make restrictions on some types of waste that we're able to accept. So this could be due to its radiological criteria, or it could be non-radiological criteria such as asbestos or certain non-radiological contaminants. Coastal erosion in particular restricts the type of waste we're able to accept. We set radiological capacities and we monitor against these. The concept of capacity is the amount of a particular radionuclide that would lead to the regulatory criteria being exceeded. So we ensure that we don't go over that. We also control some other more interesting properties, some things like voidage. So we don't want voids in the waste form because that could lead to differential settlement. Differential settlement can lead to the engineered cap being sort of ruptured effectively and lose performance. So we want that stable platform for the cap to sit on top of. But we can manage that through waste acceptance criteria, but we can also manage that through waste emplacement strategies. So again, for things like voidage, we're worried about differential settlement. So as long as you don't have very kind of if you have quite consistent levels of voidage across the patch, or you smooth it out and you control it, that's absolutely fine, as long as you don't have particular areas that are extreme. We can also do this with the radiological criteria we use in placement strategies, but it's important not to overdo the emplacement strategies because the operations team wouldn't be very happy. It would really slow things down. We can't put too many emplacement strategies. You have to really focus on the really important ones that would give the greatest benefit. Otherwise, it becomes like level 100 in a game of Tetris. It would just make things intractable. So there's just a couple of examples of the way the ESC informs how we develop and manage the site. But there's also things like understanding what we are monitoring, developing our monitoring program. So we have a massive program of monitoring for radionuclides, and the ESC tells us what we should be looking for to understand the impact on the environment. Things like the grout formulation that we're redeveloping at the moment. The cementitious grout that we put into the waste has a really strong function for the ESC. And can we improve that? Can we make it better? What do we need from it? The design of containers, the design of vaults, there's all sorts of things that we use the ESC for to make decisions with. Okay, so just my final section, and this is my like sort of pet topic that I like, but hopefully it resonates with some radiological protection people that we have here today. there's a kind of unique field in radiological protection as to how we protect future generations, and I find it quite interesting. So we have various different regulatory criteria that we have to follow for environmental safety cases. During the period where we have an environmental permit, so during the period we're operating or there's a fence around the site, there's some kind of guiding mind, we have a dose limit of 0.3 millisieverts per annum per year, which is much, a bit more to work with than we do for post-closure. Following the surrender of an environmental permit, this is where there's no site entity. Effectively, you have to assume that there's no control over the site. We have the limit, which I mentioned earlier, is 1 in a million, 10 to the -6 per year risk of a fatal cancer or editable defect. Some people refer to this as a micromort. And where the probability is 1, this is interpreted as a 20 microsievert limit, and we call this the risk guidance level. Now, we can and do take account of the probability, so it is a risk. It's the probability times the dose. But given that we're a surface facility, it's often difficult to justify probabilities of exposure much less than 1. If you think of something like coastal erosion, we think it will happen, and it's quite difficult to say there's a less than 1 of probability of 100% that people will be exposed once coastal erosion occurs. There are some instances where we can use the probability to our favour, but generally we're talking about a limit of 20 microsieverts. Again, it's a guidance level, but we generally interpret it as a limit for all practical purposes. We also separately have the dose guidance level for inadvertent human intrusion. So I just wanted to, that's not quite so interesting, but it's important to know that the 20 microsievert does not cover human intrusion, which is considered separately. But it'd be much harder to meet that 20 microsieverts limit if we had to consider human intrusion for it. So this number here is incredibly low in the context of radiological protection, much lower than the current for the public, much lower than for workers. Why is it so low? Is that appropriate? That's an incredibly high degree of protection that we have to apply for future generations. It's less than a transatlantic flight, for example, or pretty close. So why is it so low? So we're going to go right back to the start and the ethical foundations of the system of radiological protection set out in ICRP 138. I'm sure you all know ICRP 138 really well, so I don't need to tell you any of this, but I'm going to go back over it anyway. And these are the ethical foundations of the system of radiological protection. And they require that our practices should result in doing more overall good than harm. Pretty obvious one. Avoid unnecessary risk, which is referred to as prudence, and avoid an unfair distribution of risk, referred to as justice, and ensure people are treated with respect and dignity. And it's these last two that I want to unpack a little bit, these principles of justice and dignity. So if we think about future generations, again, we're disposing of radioactive waste. It's going to stay dangerous for many hundreds, thousands of years. We can't guarantee that there'll be a fence around the site and people won't live in it. There's some really key differences compared to when we're considering our impacts on the public in the present day. So what are the differences for future generations? Future generations have not benefited from the practice that led to the waste being produced. And they did not participate in the decision-making processes that led to the risk. They had no democratic stake. They had no vote to elect a government. They couldn't protest, and they didn't use the power. They didn't benefit from the power that was generated by the nuclear power stations. Now you might be able to argue whether present generations have these, but future generations definitely did not definitely did not benefit, and they definitely did not participate in the decision-making process. And that links back to the principle of justice, and the idea that it's unjust, therefore unjust to be having impacts on these future generations. They also cannot be assumed to have knowledge of the disposal and its risks. So they're getting doses that they're unaware of receiving them, and they cannot make an informed choice about how they want to be impacted. So you might say, if someone wants to live next to a nuclear power station nowadays, you can argue that's their choice, potentially. But future generations have no awareness of what's going on, and therefore it violates the principle potentially of dignity in the system of radiological protection. So I think there's an interesting analogy here with things like carbon emissions and climate change. Are we applying these same levels of protection to future generations when we consider carbon emissions? Probably not. And the fact that we do them when we're disposing of radioactive waste shows that we're a pretty good example of sustainability, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. So because of these things, because future generations haven't benefited, because they aren't able to participate in decision making, because they have no knowledge of the dose they're receiving, that's why the risk guidance level is set at what's termed as a very low level. They are afforded an enhanced degree of protection. And the implication here also is that we shouldn't really balance the risk of future generations against the risk of current generations. So we often have questions from things like waste consigners. Why am I, and our waste acceptance criteria might lead them to I don't know, decontaminating something, and they say, why should I get my operators to go in and decontaminate this waste so that I can meet your environmental safety case and protect, it's going to give me a millisievert to protect a microsievert for the future generations. That's a fair argument to have, but you've got to recognize these fundamental differences that you have here. A waste operator has made an informed choice about what it's doing, whereas the future generations don't. I should say there's always a balance to be struck, but you do have to recognize these fundamental differences when you're having those discussions. What does that mean for environmental safety cases? Well, we've got an incredibly low limit to meet, but we have an incredibly high degree of uncertainty when we're talking hundreds to thousands of years into the future. So often what we do with radiological protection is we try and make simple, maybe cautious assumptions. It's just not possible with an environmental safety case. If you were to make cautious assumptions, with the degree of uncertainties we have, it's just not. You would never be able to meet that risk guidance level of 20 microsieverts. You'd never be able to demonstrate that you're meeting it. And this is recognised in our guidance, and this is quite unique, I think, for things like environmental safety cases. It is not necessary to include an additional conservative bias. So in environmental safety cases, we don't make cautious assessments. We seek realism, and we only apply caution when we are unable to demonstrate realism. So we're careful not to be optimistic, but it would not be possible to make an environmental safety case if you were including conservative bias, given the degree of uncertainty that's involved. And that means having to go to quite a high level of detail, having to really, really think about this stuff, having to do quite a lot of research on the performance of the design of the barriers, the site evolution and things like that. And that's really where the fun of an ESC comes in. They're not just simple cautious assessments, these are really detailed assessments. So we do investigate those uncertainties. We look at the cautious end, we look at the worst end of the uncertainties, but in general, we're seeking a realistic representation of the system in order to be able to meet that low limit. And that also helps in being able to use the ESC as a tool to manage and optimize the site. Because if you're looking at your results that you come out with, and if you say, oh, the impact over here is too high, we need to do something about it. Well, if the impacts were high just because your assessment was cautious, that's kind of a false decision that you're making. You're not acting with the full knowledge of the system. But if you've got a realistic assessment, you can actually really see in the real world where your impacts are going to be. So those realistic assessments have two benefits. They enable us to demonstrate the impacts are low, but they also are a much more useful tool in optimizing and managing the site and using our understanding of environmental safety to do so. So that's coming to the end of my talk. Thanks very much for listening. Just a final thought I wanted to leave you with, and it's around the word sustainability. And this is a really strong buzzword at the moment. Loads are going on. The UN Sustainable Development Goals to looking at across the piece, not in radiological protection perspective, but ensuring we leave a sustainable legacy to future generations. And I would argue that the principles of radiological protection, the way we do environmental safety cases, to afford that enhanced degree of protection to future generations, we are a leading light in the sustainability movement. We should give us, as a radiological protection practitioners, we give ourselves a pat on the back, and these other areas like carbon emissions, like communities, waste and general waste management have a lot to learn about the principles that we apply to protecting future generations. If we applied those principles more widely, I think we'd have a much more ethical and stronger system for making the world a better place for our children and grandchildren. So thank you very much for listening. I'm here to take any questions. The final thought I would leave with is, if you've been interested in what I'm talking about, we are hiring. We do have vacancies in the team, so please do get in touch. Got my address there. I shall open the floor, or I think Sarah's going to moderate any questions.
Hi Sam, it's going to be me that asks questions. Okay. We've got some questions that have come in, and I'll just crack off with them if that's okay with you.
Sure. Okay.
First question then. Do you do anything to prevent vegetation colonization above the cap? Roots from plants and trees can invade ground very quickly, and they could increase the degradation rate off the cap.
Yes, we do. We have the cap includes quite a number of layers. One of those layers is what we call biointrusion layer to prevent roots getting down into the low permeability layers. So that's quite the biointrusion barrier is one of the upper layers that prevents any deep lying roots. Would say we do want some vegetation on the very top layer, because that stabilizes it prevents sort of the layers being washed away by rainfall. You actually want it to be a kind of grassland to keep what's the phrase I'm looking for? Yeah, it keeps it nice and prevents any erosion and denudation if you have a nice thin vegetation layer on the top. But we do have a biointrusion barrier.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Would moving to a risk-based system of waste classification result in a wider waste acceptance criteria?
Yes, it would, and this is something we're actively pursuing. I didn't have time to talk about it it was one of the topics I sort of sacrificed at the altar of not having enough time. So the environmental safety case actually demonstrates that the waste acceptance criteria would be wider if you didn't have the definition of low level waste is quite arbitrary. It's set based on it's just a number, but the environmental safety case actually demonstrates that you could expand that more widely into ILW. It would be safe to do so. Low level waste is really just a legal limit that we're operating to, and it's a limit in our permit. That being said, it's also government policy as of today that ILW should be disposed to the deep geological facility and not at surface facilities. That policy, there's a policy consultation ongoing, but as of today, we can't do that. We can demonstrate that it would be safe, but we can't actually sort of implement anything in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Next question, a bit of a long question, this. The encapsulation of waste and grouting into engineered vaults involves a lot of concrete, which emits carbon dioxide. Significant consideration is being given to doses to future generations. Are we disproportionately considering radiation exposure harm or the potential harm caused by carbon dioxide emissions when considering future generations?
So I think that's a really good question, a really good challenge. We are currently looking at the formulation of grout. Interestingly, there's another sustainability aspect. So we actually use pulverized fuel ash in our grout mix, which comes it's a waste product from coal-fired power stations, and so which is not well, in a way it's recycling, but because coal-fired power stations are coming offline, we actually need to find a new recipe for our grout. And one of the things that we're considering as a kind of factor in the recipe that we're going for is the wider sustainability aspects of the recipe that we choose. So yeah, it's a very good challenge, and it's quite hard to balance all these competing factors. It's not just dose, it's not just carbon emissions, there's cost, there's practicality. We have to balance all these things up in our optimization of the grout mix.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Has understanding your environmental safety case led you to identify things you need to do to reduce risks to ALARA for the future, such as engineered controls that would not otherwise have been considered? I'd like to know if the environmental safety cases are helping to drive out actions that would actually help to protect the future environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, across the patch, I mean, we've changed waste acceptance criteria to make and emplacement strategies that I talked about. We have Vault 8, which was one design. We actually changed the design of our current operating Vault 9 during the development of the environmental safety case. We actually changed it during construction because of some work we did in the environmental safety case relating to performance of groundwater, the groundwater pathways. We actually changed the height of the sidewalls to take account of some findings in the environmental safety case. Vault 10, we're looking at making even further improvements based on the understanding in the environmental safety case. We've changed the design of the containers to make it to make them shed water a little bit better, to improve, to minimise water ingress. There's all sorts of things we're always doing, to try and improve things. So that's a real big part of the fun.
Okay, thank you. Next question. It would be useful to understand the concept of proportionality and how this is factored into the environmental safety case. For example, operators can incur relatively high doses in the processing of waste to meet the waste acceptance criteria, and there's an argument that this is disproportionate to perceived future risk.
Yeah, there's certainly an argument. I'm hoping that question came in before I did the slide on balancing. I think I maybe answered that later on. I think it's this principle that future generations have no choice, they have no stake. They didn't benefit from the practice that's led to the waste being produced. So I think there is an argument of proportionality, but when you're making those arguments, you have to recognise the fundamental differences in who's being exposed. It's not just a case of saving 1 microsievert here to protect 1 microsievert there. There is a fundamental difference between the two generations.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What confidence do you have in the data for the early disposals into a trench? Is this a significant uncertainty and therefore risk to your environmental safety case?
It's not certain. we think we have a pretty good understanding. This is possibly not the most diplomatic answer, but we think one of the arguments to help us with the trenches is that there are releases from the trenches. At present, there are some, the clay liner isn't perfect, and we have quite a substantial monitoring program. So we know what's being released from the trenches. We know what's in the leach gate. We know what, water does get into the trenches and come back out. We collect that water and we monitor for it. So we think we've got a decent understanding of the inventory, but then we have multiple lines of reasoning in that we know what's being released now, and we know that when we put the final cap on, we've only got an interim cap on at the moment. When we put the final cap on, we know those releases will only decrease. So we can also bound it that way and reduce sort of the risk to the environmental safety case simply by showing, the releases will only go down.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I think you've probably covered this in your talk, but maybe you could reiterate. How do the conditions for acceptance link to the environmental safety case?
Yeah, I mean, there's a strong link. It's not like a one-to-one relationship. There's things from the nuclear safety case as well. But we're always actively reviewing it. I couldn't show. I think there's no real sort of firm link, but the ESC manager is effectively one of the key stakeholders in deriving the WACC, and a lot of it comes out of the development of the safety case. There's no sort of set process for it, but it's about showing that the waste, we have to show that the waste we accept is consistent with the environmental safety case. So whatever, sorry, this is not a very good answer, but yeah, that's the key point, is that the waste we accept is consistent with the environmental safety case.
Okay, thank you. Next question. To what extent was the implication of concept of discrete items assessed for the waste consigners?
I'm not really to what extent. So the concept of discrete items relates to the potential for coastal erosion of the facility. And it's this idea that when the waste is eroding into the coast, we don't want items that would be of interest to the public. So I mentioned briefly the sort of the dog walker. We don't want to have a dog walker who's going around and seeing interesting items they might pick up on the beach. It's a very interesting and quite restrictive criterion that we have, but recognizing that coastal erosion does require quite significant consideration of protecting the public. We have to apply restrictions on certain types of items.
All right, thank you very much. I think it's getting up towards 1 o'clock. I think we've got time for a couple more questions, if that's all right, Sam.
Yeah, sure.
Next one then. Does the environmental safety case go up to the next glacial period when sea levels will fall?
No, because it does at one level. No, because we're pretty confident coastal erosion will occur. But we do sort of what if calculations. What if coastal erosion doesn't occur, to sort of demonstrate how the hazard will evolve. So it's not part of our core. It's not part of our core presentation because we don't think that's how the site will evolve, but we do sort of supporting calculations on that.
Okay, thank you. And then we'll just have one more final question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Is criticality a significant consideration in the environmental safety case?
It's a consideration, and we assess it, the potential, and we have to demonstrate that it's not. I can't remember the exact wording, but it's something like it's not realistic. We have to demonstrate that it won't occur either now or in the future. So we do assess it. It's not a significant worry. So we have to do the exercise to demonstrate that it won't occur, and you have to look at things like will fissile radionuclides accumulate in the long term anywhere. That's one of the considerations that's different to, say, a sort of operational criticality assessment. So we do consider it, but it's not a particular challenge, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's just after 1 o'clock now, so I think I will draw this to a close. I'd just like to say thank you to everybody, especially Sam, for a very interesting talk. Thanks to Sarah and to Nigel, who have been, well, Nigel's in the background trying to get everything to work. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to say best wishes to Charlene, who, if she already hasn't, then she's just about to have a baby. So congratulations to Sarah, to Charlene, sorry. And thank you, everybody. Thank you. Hopefully we'll see you at the next one, which will be soon. Thanks, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you.